So good morning everyone, and delighted to have the Wind family back in the same room again since our last conference in autumn last year, although we did have a bit of an intervening party in January at our awards night, which I hope many of you attended and had a good time at. So look, delighted to have everyone here. It's another bumper conference. We've over 400 people registered. The hard part is just getting everyone in the room. It's easy getting them to the event, but the harder part is getting people inside. Look, I'm just going to kickstart the conference by doing my usual just sense of, well, where's the industry at right now, kind of a short look back at how last year performed, and then kind of a status check on where we are at the moment. And I suppose it's a difficult day to have a conference with all the Brexit talk that's going on in the background, a lot of the attention being pulled away on that. But there's a really good day to have a conference because we're actually on track today to break the all-island wind record today. So Mark's team in Airgrid have forecasted that for the first time ever today, we're expected to exceed 4,000 megawatts of wind production across the island of Ireland today. So an apt day to have our spring conference on. The other thing we're doing today is launching the first time ever the IWEA dashboard. This is something we hope to publish on an annual basis, just giving a summary of how the previous year performed. So at spring conference today is the first time we'll launch it, and it gives a snapshot to how the industry performed in 2018, and it's just really a sense of just an ongoing record-breaking cycle that this industry has experienced over the last decade or so. We hit 29% of electricity production last year, so we're edging over the 30% mark I expect this year in terms of electricity provided by wind. 19 new wind farms installed last year, totaling around 330 megawatts, bringing us to a total capacity of about 3,500, 3,600 megawatts installed in the Republic of Ireland. Interestingly as well, last year was the first time where wind produced more electricity over a full month than gas did, something we just saw repeated in February of this year. So we're now getting to a point where wind on a month-by-month basis is sometimes the largest producer of electricity in Ireland, which is a great achievement for this industry and a real signal of what was delivered over the last decade or so by the wind industry. Another very interesting number just to run by you quickly is Ireland is now #1 in the world for onshore wind penetration. We just passed the motherland, Denmark. So they have exceeded us in terms of wind energy overall because they also have a large share of offshore wind. But in terms of onshore wind, our 29% has just exceeded Denmark's 28% onshore wind penetration last year. But of course, Denmark has utilized this fantastic offshore resource they have as well. So they have about 13% coming from offshore, something we can really tap into over the next decade. But it just gives you a sense of just what has been achieved in Ireland by the wind industry, as I said, over the last 2 decades. So a really impressive delivery that has been delivered for Ireland over the last number of years. Looking out over the next year or two, we're coming to the end of the refit pipeline. So we're at 3,600 megawatts approximately right now. The total refit pipeline that's being worked on would bring us to around 4,400 megawatts. So that's, let's say, 800 megawatts that's still at some phase of development between now and 2020. However, we know out of that 4,400 megawatts that around 200 megawatts is not going to make it due to the deadline that is in place for refit projects to be built by March of next year at the very latest. So we in IWEA expect that the maximum we can see refit deliver in time for 2020 is around 4,200 megawatts. That's our latest evaluation of looking across at the different projects under development. Unfortunately, that means we're very likely to fall short of our 40% renewable electricity target, but we'll be getting very close. We expect somewhere in the maybe 38% mark is where we'll end up. The reason we're losing that 200 megawatts is many of you have probably heard that IWEA's request to get an extension from March 2020 to December 2020 for a grace period on grid delivery with relation to refit projects wasn't successful. So that means we now see the March 2020 deadline next year as the end of the refit program. And what we were really looking for there was, because it doesn't matter when you get connected in the year 2020, whether you're connected in February 2020 or November in 2020, it all makes the same contribution towards our 2020 targets, is why we were looking for that refit deadline to be extended towards the end of next year. But unfortunately, it was declined by the Minister Bruton under the premise of the 4 reasons that I've outlined here, that it's a previous extension was provided, that all delays weren't deemed grid-related in relation to refit, The new support schemes will offer better value for money. And in other words, the way that the calculation is done means that getting connected in 2019 is better than getting connected in 2020, and that's something they wanted to continue to incentivize. So we were very disappointed in that decision. We had hoped that we could have continued to deliver under the REFIT programme right up until the end of 2020 to make the maximum contribution to Ireland's 2020 targets. But unfortunately, with that decline, we know now that REFIT will come to an end in March of next year. And I think it's really important, knowing that we're in the last 12 months, that we recognise what has really worked. What has been delivered over the last 15 years or so in the wind industry is without doubt the most successful renewable energy framework that Ireland has ever put in place. Wind energy produces more renewable energy than every other renewable energy source in Ireland combined across all other sectors. And that has all grown out of an industry that didn't exist practically 20 years ago. And I think it's really important now that we go into the last 12 months of REFIT, that we look to see, well, how did that all work? What made it work? How was it such a success? And when we look back on the policy framework that really drove this industry over the last 15 years or so, these are the 4 key pillars that we always champion. The high target that was set 12, 13 years ago, that 40% renewable electricity target, set the volumes we needed to deliver. The REFIT programme provided a very stable funding mechanism so that projects could get financed and built. The Gate 3 programme made sure people had access to the electricity grid, and the wind energy guidelines in 2006 were something that the industry could manage to develop real projects within. And these not just have to be each individually working, but they all have to work together. And that is a great achievement to have, not just from the policy side on putting these in place, a coordination point and making sure they all worked together, and then an industry delivering it. So we managed to grow, as I said, from almost a non-existent industry 20 years ago to now the largest producer of renewable energy in Ireland. And a world leader, a true leadership in this sector is definitely being demonstrated. And not only was it delivered in volume, it was delivered at value. So hopefully many of you have seen the report we launched in IWEA in January, Wind for €1, where we asked Baringa to calculate over the period 2000 to 2020, how much did the wind sector actually cost the consumer? They looked at the PSO as a cost because there is a subsidy that had to be provided, but they also looked at the savings we've provided on the wholesale electricity market by driving down the price of electricity. And when you looked at the two overall and looked at what was the net cost, it came back at €1 per person per year. In terms of carbon abatement cost, it was €2 per tonne. That is incredible value considering the volumes that were delivered. And I think it's a very important moment for not just the industry, but policymakers and decision makers to look at why was this a success? How was it a success? Because it's absolutely vital that we replicate this over the coming decade in trying to grow the industry even further and deliver on our decarbonisation requirements. So I just want to really mark this occasion now that we are on the home straight of REFIT to just make sure the industry gives itself a pat on the back and congratulates itself for delivering, as I said, what is clearly the most successful renewable energy policy ever envisaged or ever put together in Ireland to date. And as I said, that puts us on the home straight for 2020. And from a policy framework point of view, all focus now is trying to replicate that success out to the year 2030. And that's very much the live debate that's going on right now, is trying to replicate those successful pillars that took place over the last 2 decades and trying to make them happen also for the year 2030. So what are those new policy frameworks? So let's say in terms of a target, we now have to set a new one. That's going to be set under our National Energy and Climate Plan, which is currently being consulted on over the last few months and is going to be defined over the next 9 months because we have to deliver it back to the European Commission by the end of the year. We have to put in place a new support scheme or a new stabilisation framework. REFIT has now come to an end. We now need that renewable electricity support scheme to be put in place as soon as possible and to be as effective at delivering on volume as REFIT was over the last decade or two. We need a new grid connection regime. Gate 3 delivered huge volumes of grid capacity and allowed projects to get connected. We now see the start of the new ECP process, but we need that to deliver volumes so that people are actually getting grid offers to connect into to be able to participate in the renewable electricity support scheme when it goes live. And finally, we need a planning regime that works. We need WEGs that find a balance between allowing projects to develop and protecting communities nearby. And we need a planning regime for the offshore sector under MAFA. So in the rest of my presentation, I'm just going to briefly run through where things are at within these 4 pillars. And I think as much as I dig into the specifics of each one, I think what will be the ultimate success of us delivering at scale over the next 10 years is the coordination of all of these. They need to speak to one another, they need to be aligned with one another, and they need to be not just in terms of timelines, but in terms of volumes and in terms of risks. There needs to be some coordination that means all of these pieces work together, because one pillar failing means none of them work. And so just to give you a flavour of where all of these are at, with the target, something that maybe went under the radar and didn't hit the headlines as much as you might expect is we have a huge task already on our hands. Just before the end of the year, the first draft of the National Energy and Climate Plan was published, and they set a minimum target for the electricity sector of 55% renewable electricity by 2030. What does that mean in terms of volume? It means in the next 10 years, we need at least 3,000 megawatts more onshore wind and 1,800 megawatts more offshore wind. And that 55% is very much the working basis as a minimum. We in IWEA, as everyone knows, has been calling on a 70% renewable electricity target through our 70 by 30 work. Hopefully many of you have seen it. But it just demonstrates that the most important thing is we have to deliver volume over the next 10 years. That means the other pillars, the support scheme, the grid access and the planning, they are absolutely vital to put in place now that we know we have to deliver at that scale within this time frame. We are effectively doubling as an industry over the next 10 years. We have to do what we did in the last 20 years, now in 10. And that's a great signal for the industry to see, and it means the next 10 years are very, very bright if we can get that policy framework in place. Tomorrow we have the Climate Action Committee coming in to give their views on a panel session. And the reports coming out of the Climate Action Committee are that they're supporting the call for a 70% renewable electricity target. So this is very much a working minimum. The other thing I'll just say about the targets is it's back to this coordination element that's so important. Right now we have a lot of plans in progress. We have the Climate Action Committee working on their plan, and as I said, very positive news coming out of that it'll support the 70 by 30 target. We have an all-of-government plan being led by Minister Bruton, which is going to set a working agenda, I imagine, for the coming years. And then we have the National Energy and Climate Plan, which is something we're obliged to provide to the European Commission by the end of the year. And I think, so keep your eyes out for a lot of announcements about future-looking plans. And what we're calling for is, however these end up, that they're also emphasize the importance of coordinated approach. So when we see the Climate Action Plan, when we see the all-of-government plan, we expect that all of that has to fit together into something that unifies itself within the National Energy and Climate Plan, which is due by the end of the year. And hopefully in that we will see at the minimum 55% renewable electricity, and if not, get as close to the 70% renewable electricity target that we can. The panel session just after this session is where we've invited some of the key stakeholders that will be required to deliver on that ambition over the next 10 years. We have Mark's team here in Airgrid that will be pivotal to that. Paddy Hayes from the ESB networks, who have been instrumental in delivering on wind energy up until now, will play an essential role. Aoife McAvilly from the CRU will be central also in delivering our decarbonisation agenda over the next 10 years, along with some people from the industry itself to reflect on what's required over the next 10 years to deliver on this ambition. So we're really, I think from a renewable electricity ambition point of view, it's a matter of we have a lot to do and we may have even more to do. So we're in a very healthy state in terms of looking to the next 10 years and having a mandate to deliver at scale. Because we have to deliver at that scale, it's vital that these other elements are put in place. So with the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme, really positive news last summer when the high-level design came out. In IWEA, we've been really working hard to formulate some very specific views on how we see the auction designs within the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme working. For any of you in our membership, if you're part of the Markets Committee, that's an ongoing piece of work. But the only comments we would have on that is it just needs to happen faster. Now that the refit REFIT scheme will come to an end in March of next year. We need to make sure we reduce the gap between REFIT and the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme as much as possible to keep up the momentum into the next decade, especially with demand growing. So we're delighted to see the high-level design, delighted to see the importance of moving the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme along, but we just need to see it happen faster now that we know we're going to have a gap after REFIT, because we need to minimise that gap as much as possible. So we just need a bit more urgency and speed in terms of delivering the first auctions around the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme. And there'll be a session this afternoon that will go into some of the specifics that we've been working in IWEA around the support scheme. In relation to grid connection policy, we don't have a session on that at the conference itself because we had a dedicated policy forum on that in January. If anyone wants to see the presentations or videos from that, they're on our website. But I would say overall, it's in a reasonably okay state. We have ECP1, the first round of grid connection policy took place last year, and those offers are now being processed. There was around 600 megawatts of wind that is in that process. But key is to make sure that this regular batch scheme continues, that we see regular ECP patches carried out on an annual, or at the very least a biannual basis, because our key message is getting an offer for the grid shouldn't be the bottleneck for projects getting into the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme. We need volumes delivered through the ECP scheme so we have competition within the Renewable Electricity Subsidy Scheme. But it's the CRU are working on this, and we're delighted, and maybe Aoife can share some updates on that when she's talking on the panel after this session. So it's great to see that scheme is there as a structure. We need to see it regularly delivering volumes of offers. On the planning side, we're expecting the wind energy guidelines imminently. There's been numerous announcements that they're coming within weeks. We're expecting them probably by the end of the month or very soon after that. So we have a session then in the afternoon that will focus in on what the work we're doing in IWEA around the wind energy guidelines in the afternoon. In IWEA, we're trying to make sure that we understand the impacts of those wind energy guidelines. Until we see them, we can't fully establish it, but we want to make sure that whatever guidelines are brought out don't put an overly burdensome additional cost onto the consumer without strong justification for why it's needed. So we generally get from the vast majority of people involved in projects, the vast majority of people are very supportive of wind projects when they live nearby them. So we just need to emphasize that we've highlighted a balance between the ability to develop projects and protecting people near the wind farms that are developed. I pulled this graphic out sometime when the electrification of rural Ireland was taking place. We found this newspaper headline that only 35% of people wanted electricity in their area. So it's not new that it's difficult to build infrastructure near people's homes. But as we've seen, where would we be today if we didn't take the bold step to roll out rural electrification 60, 70 years ago? So it's always a difficult thing to build large-scale infrastructure, and something we just need to make sure we find the balance right on. The other thing we'll do in the afternoon session is launch a report that IWEA just carried out with Ionic Consulting. There's a number of copies on the IWEA desk if anyone wants one. It's a very short report we put together that outlines the steps that you need to go through to develop an onshore wind project. And this is something just to make sure that people understand what the timelines are, what the different phases are, in terms of educating the masses on what we deal with in terms of the challenges as a wind industry. So if you want to grab that report, it's at the IWEA desk if it's something of interest. And finally then tomorrow morning we'll have a focus on the offshore section. So a lot of the RES stuff that will be talked about in the market session and a lot of the target stuff that I've just covered in the 2030 outlook will cross over between onshore and offshore. But one of the key things that stands alone with offshore is MAFA and putting in place a planning regime for the offshore sector. So that'll be one of the key highlights of tomorrow morning's session. But it'll cover a lot of other things as well, especially we have another speaker in, Robbie Ahern from AirGrid, who'll talk about how they're progressing with grid connection specifically in relation to offshore. That'll be tomorrow morning's session. And the final thing I'll just mention in terms of strategic things we have ongoing in IWEA is, as people have known, we've been stuck in a bit of a standoff with rates in relation to wind farms over the last 4 or 5 years. So I just want to make sure that all members are aware that IWEA has now engaged in a negotiation with the Valuations Office to see if we can find a compromise on how rates should be calculated for onshore wind farms so that we can agree on an industry-wide methodology that both sides can join up to. And if anyone is interested in that piece of work, I've just put in the contact details for my colleague Ross, who's leading that work, because we'll be organising a workshop on rates over the next few weeks or so. So do get involved if that's something you want to have your say on, and I want to make sure that all members have it flagged up in front of them. So look, I just want to end with, these are the new pillars. The 2020 policy framework is on the home straight. It is absolutely brilliant that there's such a high level of ambition being discussed and being asked to deliver on. We just need to make sure that these pillars are robust, that they're in place, and they're fully coordinated and aligned with each other, so we can double the size of this industry over the next 10 years. So a very exciting decade ahead. We just might have a bit of bumpy times getting started, but once we do, I can see a scale over the next 10 years will be a prominent discussion once again. So look, enjoy the next day and a half. Delighted to have everyone here again. I'd like to just say a big thanks to Senvion for being our main sponsors for the programme, along with Arthur Cox, Mason Hayes and Curran and Statcraft for the supporting sponsorship. A huge thanks to the IWEA staff for all the hard work that went into organising. Getting over 400 people in a room on a single day and a half can bring its own challenges, and the team have done a great job in getting everyone here today on time almost. And look, a huge thanks to speakers, exhibitors and delegates and the IWEA membership for coming along. So look, I hope you enjoy the next day and a half. As I said, we're on the home straight for 2020, but a very busy and large volume decade ahead. Thank you.